the way in which we teach young people in school about relationships and sex education, about respectful relationships. Schools is an opportunity for that teaching to take place. And that's something that Labour has always been very committed to. And, you know, we've been a real champion of compulsory relationships and sex education, age appropriate, but, you know, beginning early, because it's never too early to teach children to respect one another. And I think we also need to know that teachers and school staff, would be interesting to hear from Manny and you too, Katharine, as practicing teachers now, about how we make teachers feel confident around you. Sorry, we're having a division bell. I'm so sorry. It's just very noisy. You won't hear me for a minute.
We'll let Kate pause there. I think maybe that might be a point when Kate's finished speaking, Amna, for you to come in and comment perhaps on the idea of sex education, because obviously you've been working on the Expect Respect toolkit and delivering some of that training to teachers. So it'll be interesting for you to comment on that and sort of talk about how, you know, where you see that moving as well.
Yeah, I mean, I echo kind of what Kate started with, which is that none of this was really surprising. What came out of the Ofsted report was actually things that, you know, when I started working for Women's Aid over 6 years ago now, it was the project that I was running in terms of delivering prevention work around gender-based violence in schools. And we were using some of the same statistics that unfortunately have gotten worse now. You know, the Ofsted report statistics are much worse than anything that we've kind of been working with previously. And so there is a massive issue in terms of how we create prevention work that really starts at a very early age. And that's what the Expect Respect toolkit is. It starts at the age of 4 to the age of 18, and it really kind of takes teachers, gives the teachers the opportunity to explore issues that we feel are the root causes or that can lead to violence against women and girls in school settings, in society. You know, schools are just another variation of what society looks like, what our workplaces look like, what our communities look like. And, you know, many of the attitudes that we see at home, that we see with our friends, with our communities, are going to exist in schools. And so the toolkit covers like a whole load of issues around gender, around assumptions, around attitudes. It talks about kind of how we manage our feelings, how we're responsible for our feelings and behaviors, you know, those kind of really key early things around how we take accountability and responsibility for what we do. It also teaches young people and children how to resolve conflict in a peaceful way. You know, how we have good relationships that are respectful, that are positive. It looks at kind of what does abusive relationships look like for kind of going into some of the older years. And we've also added a lot of stuff, which I guess Kate kind of hinted on a little bit about what happens outside of school, which is a lot of the online related abusive behaviors that we have seen come out, you know, the sending of inappropriate images, sexual images, you know, pressure and stalking that happens outside of that school environment, that continuation of kind of abusive behaviors that might start at school from peer groups that then continues on for children and young people. And that's what essentially, that's what the toolkit starts to highlight. What are our behaviors like online? How do we give consent in the online space? Because many young people are having, you know, relationships in online spaces. So there's a lot that is covered in the toolkit. What we're trying to do with the Expect Respect toolkit, what I've done so far is kind of run an initial training program that was open to professionals, and over the last, it's been a really busy time since April when we launched kind of the project. I've delivered training to about 600 different professionals, and you can imagine that the Ofsted report then started a whole load of new, you know, teachers and schools really wanting to kind of get involved, because I think a lot of it is about confidence. It's about knowing what you are going to be delivering, having the resources and the tools to be able to deliver it, and and being able to go back to somebody and say, is this okay? Am I doing this okay? Does this feel right? And I think when you provide all of that support, I think that's when you start to see that culture shift in schools, because you need the backing of everyone. And I think when everyone sees that this is their responsibility, and each of us are responsible for this area of work, then we start to see that shift happening in schools.
That's a fantastic response and a really great insight into the work that you've been doing. So thank you for that. And it really builds on what Kate was trying to say when the bell unfortunately interrupted her. So she's put in the chat that it's so important now that we equip school staff with that confidence to deal with reports of sexual abuse, harassment, everyday sexism as well. What's kind of the response been then, Amna, in terms of what kinds of things have teachers perhaps or school staff found the most challenging? Where are the aspects where you think they particularly need that training or need that level of confidence?
So, I mean, the things that, I mean, lots of things have come out. I mean, huge amounts of support that schools have asked for. I think having a clear pathway about what it is that they would be delivering and where it would be in the school curriculum has been really key. And that's something that I'm hoping that the head teachers that are part of the program will help facilitate, because the toolkit really fits and embeds into the sex and relationship curriculum. So it's a case of just trying to fit it together, and you know, a number of schools are saying that they're willing to do that, and that's brilliant. One of the other issues is about how you engage parents in the conversations. What kinds of things do you say? How do you shift, you know, how do you engage parents to actually have those conversations at home? Because it's one thing doing it in schools, but if it's not happening at home, then there's a bit of a clash. There's been lots of things around understanding how to deal with disclosures, particularly when they happen in a classroom environment or a group environment. Lots of issues around you know, safeguarding and not knowing necessarily where to go to, what's the best way to approach an issue when it happens. I've heard a lot of female teachers state some of their own experiences of sexual harassment from students, and that's another area that is teachers are particularly concerned about, and not knowing how to respond effectively. I think, yeah, there are so many issues. And, you know, for teachers, I think the toolkit and other resources, and there are many available, just provide that kind of structure of how they can cover something. And I think that is one of the things that they found particularly useful with the Expect Respect toolkit, but in kind of combination with some training and being able to ask, well, okay, so I'm asking this question, or I'm reading out this statement. What should I be listening out for? What is it that is supposed to come out from this particular example? And we do this, or, you know, we do this all the time. So there's, you know, statements around, you know, gender attitudes, for instance, where we say, you know, women should be in charge, and kind of get kids to agree, disagree, share their opinions. And essentially, it's just about exploring what their attitudes are at a particular age. And it's not about challenging those children, because I don't think we should be challenging children who are 6, 7 years old about their attitudes about whether, you know, they believe men or women should be in charge. But it's about understanding where they're coming from, and really unpicking that. So why do you believe that? You know, what is it that you see in your life that makes you believe that men are in charge, or that women are in charge, or whatever? So it's about kind of, you know, for teachers, I think it's about, okay, there's an activity here and there's some description about how to deliver it, but then, you know, what should I be listening for? What do I do in these situations? So that's all we kind of try and provide, is, you know, running the sessions, showing staff, and it's not open just to teachers, it's open to other children's workers, other refuge provision workers who have children in their spaces. And so they provide kind of that support in terms of, you know, knowing what might come up in any particular session and how to respond to it appropriately. So there's so many issues, and, you know, it's kind of trying to find the right balance and support that can be offered. But yeah, they're doing a brilliant job considering the circumstances that we're all currently in and having to balance in particularly in the school environment.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, that structure is, you know, as a classroom teacher, is so useful, just to know, right, this is the situation, here is how, you know, a suggestion of how I can respond to it. Manny, I saw you nodding along when Amna was talking about the involvement of parents, and obviously Kate has said that clearly this is not an issue for schools on their own, this is an issue for society. What kinds of things have you done or maybe thought about doing, you know, to kind of involve the parents in your own school community?
You know, just to really echo what everybody's already said, you know, it is something that we all have a role to play. And if there's one lesson from the pandemic that I perhaps didn't appreciate pre-pandemic, is just how important a role schools play. When you think about being pillars, role models, where do people look to want guidance and advice, and that means that whilst one of the bugbears that school leaders will have will be that, look, if ever there's any sort of social ill, there'll be an expectation that schools are the first port of call, but then you have to recognize that is the role that you're called to do, because if schools aren't central to this, then where else, how else are we going to tackle the issue? So I think there has to be an acceptance. I think we underestimate how difficult parents find or have found having the conversation around these issues. And I think in terms of our own context, perhaps the first thing that we've done is to listen and to give youngsters a platform to talk, both young women and young men, in terms of their experiences and what it's like to be a youngster growing up in today's world. The impacts of social media, differing expectations in terms of the world of work, different expectations in terms of education and your future. These are all kind of huge impacts. I'm, relatively speaking, probably just below average age of the teaching staff within my school. And I still feel that generationally, I'm in a different space. My childhood was very, very different. So I think creating the culture and the environment where young people and parents feel free to talk, I think, is really, really quite important. And that's been the starting point for us. I think there's a lot of parents who are terrified of having the conversation. They're absolutely terrified. They when you think about, this being a shock to many people, you have to think, well, if you work and you speak to young people on a regular basis, then this isn't going to be a shock. It can only be a shock if you are kind of, attempting to kind of, bury your head in the sand. So we have to have that opportunity to kind of listen to the youngsters. From a curriculum perspective, one of the things that we've worked on quite hard is the notion of healthy relationships. And again, we take for granted that, youngsters will, easily come to understand what a healthy relationship looks like. And that's not the case. You can't make the assumption. You can't make the assumption that parents will naturally have an understanding of what a healthy relationship looks like. And when you look at, social media, the accessibility of pornography, the television shows which, a lot of youngsters consume, and this isn't a critique of them, it's just an observation, you have to be thinking, well, what are those sorts of messages? And I guess the last point on this is that there is a kind of intersectional aspect to this as well, so I'm sort of mindful of thinking about the ways in which people, other identities which people have influence how they view the issue. And as an educator whose primary kind of role is to kind of just broaden the horizon of youngsters and give them as much opportunity as possible, the curriculum has to serve the purpose of providing those youngsters with the ability to be the best versions of themselves and to have the opportunity to kind of, if they make the choice to, do whatever it is that they wish to do. That's an important aspect of what I feel I'm here to do. apologies if I ramble there, but they were just my sort of initial thoughts on the matter.
No, that's great, thank you, and obviously really, really interesting and important points that you've raised. And you know, the idea of kind of schools being the hub of our communities and a place where we do have the power to impact on people's opinions, people's thoughts, and the way that young people behave. It's just, like you say, we can't work alone, we have to work within the community. I think it's interesting there talking about the curriculum, and obviously that focus on healthy relationships is unbelievably important. And I've seen myself in various different lessons how the skill level and the confidence that is needed to guide young people through those conversations. One of the things that we've been looking at in my school this year is kind of gender equality within the wider school curriculum. So I'm sure lots of you are aware, you know, many schools now are looking at diversifying the curriculum. After Black Lives Matter and those protests last year, lots of people then did it with decolonising the curriculum, and clearly if we want to be intersectional educators, we need to widen that on a greater level. Perhaps this is a question for you, Sandra, and for Kate, in terms of what kinds of things do you think that the DFE can be doing to help us as teachers diversify our curricula, to make sure that we are not, you know, we're not presenting that one view of history, that one view of, you know, the stereotypical white male scientist, something like that.
I think that, feeding in from what other people have said, I think the curriculum is absolutely central to this. And I define curriculum in very holistic terms. It's everything that a young person learns while they're in school. So we have the formal curriculum that gets assessed, we get formal curriculum that's not assessed, we get the curriculum in co-curricular activities, sport, music, and so on. And we have all the other things that kids learn when they're in school, when they're in the corridors and when they're in the dining room and the locker room and so on, that we might have called the ethos of the school. All of that is the learning. And it seems to me that a good curriculum needs to be fit for purpose, and it needs to be, but it needs to be flexible enough to respond to changes, societal changes, economic changes, climate changes, as they happen. And the Ofsted report on the gender issues, the racial issues that, you know, we've been talking about so prominent in the last few days. These are major things that are now, they were always there, but they're being highlighted now in a way perhaps that they weren't before. And I think the behaviors that we're seeing are actually highlighting the fact that the curriculum in respect of both gender issues and racial issues is not fit for purpose as it is. Now, changing the curriculum and improving the curriculum is a complex thing, and it's very important, however tempted we are, not to just add things on. It's not like putting washing on a clothesline. You run out of space eventually if you do that. Again, it's got to be an absolutely holistic approach from the bottom up. So with regard to gender equality, there is specific learning, and I think there is a place for it in the PSHE curriculum, though it's worth noting that that is not a statutory curriculum, and that's a whole other issue I would come back to. But more importantly, it absolutely has to infuse the whole curriculum. And Katharine, you were saying about the boy who said there were no female chemists. The Runnymede Trust published a report only a few weeks ago, and I think the report was actually about racial issues, but this particular statistic came up in it, that I think in the last year, in 2019, in GCSE English literature, the proportion of students who answered a question on a text by a female author was 7%. And I can't even comprehend that when I think of, you know, all the wonderful female authors that are out there. So I think we do need to look very carefully at how we integrate these things into the curriculum. And I would go further than that. I think the time is right now, and I put this to Kate, the time is right now for a full review of the whole curriculum. We have so many changes in society, so many changes going on around us. COVID has changed the dynamics of schools, the dynamics of learning. Youngsters have fallen behind. They have missed education. And I note that Ofsted is currently looking at trying to future-proof GCSEs or qualifications for next year in light of COVID or what might happen. And so they should. But I think that's the wrong end to start with. The qualifications are only the output. When we review and change and improve, we have to begin with the curriculum. We have to begin with what is learned.
That's a fantastic insight there, Sandra. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, I think a really stunning statistic, isn't it? You know, 7% of young people have, you know, the knowledge to write about it. The awarding bodies immediately responded by saying that there was a good proportion of female writers on the syllabuses. I did a little check of that. There are a goodly number, shall we say, but certainly male writers are very much more in evidence. But there certainly are opportunities, and I think it goes back to something that was said earlier also about the importance of training teachers and supporting teachers and continuous professional development for teachers. If you take the English literature example, take on new texts, look at new authors, different ones, not the ones that the school has traditionally taught. No, Kate, I'd love to throw that question open to you now and to think about, you know, as Sandra said, how can we ensure that this curriculum change, which she has said she feels is so necessary, how can we ensure that that isn't kind of tokenistic and that it actually feels meaningful and sustainable? What kinds of things would you recommend for us to achieve that?
So I think the first thing I'd say is I absolutely agree with Sandra about mainstreaming gender and other equalities strands in every part of the curriculum. And, you know, Sandra's talked about English literature texts, but you could think about which musicians do children learn about in music classes, which scientists do they hear about, what artists, visual artists do they study, which mathematicians are they taught about. You know, you can absolutely mainstream equalities into every aspect of what children and young people are taught. I also think it's what young people want. If you ask what they want from their education, they talk about life skills, about preparation for real life. And you know, they are growing up in a richly diverse community, a multi-faith, multicultural, multi-ethnic country, and that's an immense strength for our country. Actually, our diversity is a real asset for us. And so if we're really to equip our young people to make the most of the country they're growing up in, and give them the life skills to operate to their full potential, then we want them to appreciate and be enriched by and to make the most of understanding how different cultures in our country live together and how we can be together as good neighbours, supporting one another to succeed, to prosper and to thrive. The other thing I think I would say, I'm not sure if this has really come up yet, because obviously for a while I couldn't hear you very well while the bell was ringing so loudly. It's quite like a school round here. You teachers would feel very old. I think there's the thing about role models. And when I've talked more about race equality and ethnic diversity in the curriculum, one of the things that's been said to me quite often is that we need to look at who's in our schools. It's really unusual to see, it's not really unusual, it is less usual, for example, to see women, people from minority ethnic backgrounds in very senior leadership positions, particularly in secondary schools, but there are a lot of women who are frontline classroom teachers, and particularly in early years and primary settings. We need a real diversity of school staff, teachers, school leaders, support staff at every level in the education system. And I'll just tell you a story about how much this actually does matter to the way that young people hear messages subliminally. And this goes back a long way, and this wouldn't happen now, but it was when I was a child. And my dad was a head teacher, and he was leaving his school to go to another post. And I remember he was chatting to a friend about this, and the friend said to him, "So will your deputy take over from you?" And my dad said, and I overheard this conversation, "Oh no, they wouldn't give a school this big to a woman." It was a very large school. Now, I am talking about the 1970s. It is a very different world today. But I have to tell you that stuck with me still sticking with me now, 50 years later, that my dad said that. And he wasn't making a judgment. He wasn't saying they shouldn't give it to a woman. It was a simple matter of fact, as he saw it, that they would not appoint a woman to head a school as big as that. Now, what that did to me was that I thought, God, you've told me all my life, Dad, that I can be whatever I want. I can live my dreams. I should be ambitious. And then quite casually in a conversation where you're not even really talking, you're not talking to me. You've just told me that my aspirations are actually limited by my gender. And young people, you could hardly say, I guess, that it's really held me back in the long run. But we've got to understand how important role models and messages are for young people's sense of their own future. And I guess I would just say, let's think about what sort of subliminal messages are we giving young people today if they don't see a real diverse representation in our school leadership and school staff teams.
No, that's a fantastic message, and I think, Manny, you're involved, aren't you, in facilitating a programme for future female leaders, which is obviously I attended a session of that recently, and that was unbelievably inspiring to find women who are, striving to show that they can achieve that and they can really implement that change. Obviously, in terms of role models, that is so important, and that's come up, hasn't it, in terms of curriculum as well. Can girls see female sports people or scientists or explorers, and equally can boys see male nurses or male teachers, things like that. Manny, I wonder if that's something you've thought about at your school, or kind of how are you dealing with that topic of role models?
Yeah, that's really good point about role models. As you mentioned, we've been involved in a project for the last 3 years, which is the explicit aim is to increase the number of women senior leaders and head teachers in the local area. And so we run a course and we involve local schools, and what we try to do is that all of the keynote speakers are existing women leaders, mostly in education, but it could be in business, commerce, sport, and from a purely selfish point of view, there's an element of saying, look, there's an enormous amount of talent within the system, and I need to make sure as a leader that I harness that. But at a more fundamental level is, I've got this real belief that, and this isn't just about the issue of role models, that the more diverse voices you have in the room where decisions are being made, I think the better the decisions you make, because people bring their own experiences, their own insight, I can only come at it from my particular, experience and my vantage point. And, when I think about, what Sandra talked about in terms of the curriculum, if you have a senior leadership team that, is relatively monocultural and has had, a similar background, then don't be surprised if the curriculum that comes up is kind of reflective of that, of that experience. So you want different voices to sort of say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And what I would say, different authentic voices, because, I'm not, I hate doing things for the purposes of kind of tick box. I want it to be, I want youngsters to have a diverse diet, because having a diverse diet in your curriculum is the best preparation for the world in which you're going to inhabit. Not have a feeling that, I'm doing this because Ofsted have said this or because the government have said this. So I think the issue of role models are, really quite important. And as I said, different people will experience different things in life. And one of the kind of important messages that, was, talking to youngsters in assembly is that, I fully expect that the youngsters in front of me, some of them will be High Court judges, some of them will be journalists, some of them go to politics, others will go down, different pathways. I have to be confident as a head teacher that I've helped to develop the characteristics and inclinations that if they were in a position of power, they would make the right decisions. And what I mean by the right decisions, I mean that we would have sufficiently given them an education where they had a sense of empathy, and they made decisions that were genuinely for the good of society and community, and not just their own self-interest. And I think the only way in which you can develop those characteristics amongst those youngsters is you have to expose them to the world in which they live in. You have to have those honest conversations. I mean, when we came into school on Monday, and again, this point about curriculum, the flexibility of the curriculum, one of the things that I would say as a school that we're weak on is that we introduced discrete PSHE, personal development, which has been absolutely brilliant for Key Stage 3. But we haven't dedicated enough time, I think, in the upper year groups, and that's a failing on my part. But it's one of the areas of strength in Key Stage 3, and the youngsters love it because it's probably the single area in the curriculum which is flexible to the world in which they are living in right now. So on Monday, they're coming into school, and they want to be able to deconstruct what has happened on Sunday. They want some sort of opportunity to talk about, well, we've been on social media and we've seen this. They want that opportunity. And I think one of the lessons for me is that has been an area which for too long, I think, has been kind of downgraded within schools. And actually, it's really important. We have to give youngsters the ability to kind of deconstruct, whether that's looking at issues relating to gender, race, fake news, understanding the media, the environmental challenge. These, to me, is about kind of giving youngsters a tool to step into other people's shoes, so they can understand where they're coming from. And I think that idea of curriculum, but also people who are in the room who are diverse so that they can input in the construction of the curriculum is really important.
That's great, Manny. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say it links in with you, Sandra, doesn't it? With, the idea that you said about the curriculum being everything that the children are learning. It's not just the maths, English and science. And this, in a sense, is far more important than those facts for the the qualifications. But please go on and say what you wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted, I mean, I think, couldn't agree more, I think, with what Manny has been saying, which is why I did throw in earlier the fact that PSHE is not statutory. Bits of it are, the sex and relationship education is. And in reviewing the whole of the curriculum, but if something had to be done quickly, I would review that whole area of the curriculum that is PSHE and citizenship, which is statutory, and look at it again and start from scratch and put it together. And if we really are saying that these things are really important, then why is it the area of the curriculum that is not statutory? And, you know, years of experience, I know that most of our schools are very, very good. They do a wonderful job. And PSHE is a very important aspect of the curriculum in many, many schools. But if a school wants to dodge it, if they want to ignore it, well, they can. It just doesn't make sense to me that it isn't statutory. It doesn't have a program of study. It doesn't have the same status as other qualifications. I also agreed very much with what Manny said about the diverse voices. And it's so crucial in creating policy in a school, whether it's curriculum or other policy, to have those diverse voices. You can't always have them on your staff for one reason or another. So if they don't exist among your management team, there are ways of using people from outside the school to come in and give those diverse voices if it doesn't exist in the school establishment.
That's really interesting, thank you. And I think I'd be interested from any of our panelists who want to chip in at this point to know, how do you think we can then start to bring more diverse voices into our education system? Like you say, it's necessary, it's valued, but how can we, you know, convince bright young graduates of all different backgrounds to become a teacher or to, you know, become involved in education policy?
So recruitment to teacher training is actually up quite substantially this year, and that's because in probably the pandemic has made people look for secure careers, and we're always going to need teachers. But I'm very concerned about flight from the profession. Teachers don't stay. School leaders in particular are very likely, in my opinion, to feel after the pressures they faced during this pandemic that they need a break. And that means that we're going to lose a lot of experience, and that is concerning. And at the same time, we want our very best teachers to be in the classroom teaching the kids who perhaps have the biggest learning needs and the biggest social and emotional needs, and also those children who will not have the opportunity for being introduced to diverse cultures and experiences at home, perhaps because they live in a fairly monocultural area of the country, or perhaps because their family is untypically has not been used to being exposed to other cultures, so there's no sort of sharing of that experience in the home. So I think we've got to think really hard about recruitment. I think we've got to think very, very hard about retention. I think we've got to think hard about workload, because that is what is driving teachers out of the profession, I think, more than anything. But we also have to think about pay and reward and status. And one thing that I think is really interesting is how different ethnic communities in this country think about teaching as a profession. Now, when I go to some of the schools in my constituency, where, for example, we've got a lot of Asian students, students of Asian heritage, their parents want them to be doctors, they want them to be dentists, they want them to be pharmacists. They don't often say that their parents want them to be teachers. And I think there's a really interesting question about why certain cultures and in parts of the white community, I think you would get the same thing. We don't want our kids in teaching. We don't think it's for them. We're suspicious of teachers. We didn't have a good time ourselves at school. What is it that, how do different communities perceive teaching and the teaching profession? And would they encourage their children to enter it? Now, I think we've got a really good opportunity at the moment, because I think parents' respect for teachers, as a result of what they've seen during the pandemic, you know, when parents have tried to do home learning, they've realized that teaching is hard. It's really, really difficult to teach kids. And there's the opportunity for a whole new relationship between teachers and parents. Parents want to be more involved in their children's education. And so this is a real opportunity too, I think, to have more involvement from parents and wider family members from more diverse backgrounds in the life of the school and in children's education, and to introduce the idea of teaching as a profession to more people, because they're becoming more engaged with what's going on in their child's school. But in the end, you know, there are plenty of examples of other professions and industrial sectors or voluntary activities that have had to work hard to reach out to diversify their workforce, to go out and engage in communities and encourage people to apply, to give them the support that they'll need to access a profession, to develop their careers in that profession, to be mentored and to see role models, as we were saying a few moments ago. And I think that that means that we need a workforce strategy which has diversity in its workforce as a real foundation, a building block. And if you look at the workforce strategy that we have at the moment, actually it's not very strategic. We don't really have a very strategic approach from the DFE around this. And I think there is a real opportunity to think about what does a really good workforce strategy look like with diversity as an essential element of it.
No, absolutely, Kate. Thank you. And I think this is an issue which, obviously, as a young teacher, that comes up in conversations, doesn't it? The things about like the status of the profession, the pay, the attraction of it for young graduates. So absolutely a key thing for us to be thinking about moving forward.
I just add to kind of what Kate was saying, because actually in lots of Arab cultures, going into teaching is often the only profession that you're encouraged to do as a woman. And you know, my dad was very pushy about me becoming a teacher when I was younger, and I even studied English language and literature at university in order to go into teaching. But then didn't, just because it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do. But there, you know, I think there is many issues, and you know, I think about my dad, who is a teacher, and some of his experiences as an Arab man in some of the school environments that he's worked in, and you know, his experiences have not been particularly positive in terms of people's attitudes towards him, some of the things that the students say to him, some of the complaints, enormous complaints from parents, you know, over really minor and petty things. And you know, when he's discussing this with senior staff members, and you know, and they're saying they don't understand why parents are complaining, because there's nothing wrong. They, you know, they've checked the sessions, they come and observe, they do all of these things, and then find that there's nothing actually wrong with the sessions, and then they put it down to racism, Islamophobia, you know, that these are attitudes that some parents have towards some of the teachers that are teaching. And you know, and I have to say, you know, it's taken a while for my dad to kind of figure out whether it's a profession that he wants to remain in, because of some of the negative experiences that he's had. And so I think there's a wider conversation about actually then, when you have that workforce, you know, when you have people from different communities coming in, how are they supported, how are they protected, how are they you know, provided with additional support that they will need, because they're experiencing slightly different things in terms of, you know, the context of their teaching profession that maybe white staff members won't ever experience. And I think it's that understanding of racism, of Islamophobia, of anti-Semitism, of, you know, homophobia, all of those things that might start to come up for some of those teachers that are just not addressed normally. And I think we do need to reflect. I think sometimes I always challenge anyone who kind of tries to do a kind of diversify their workforce without doing the proper work in their organizations first, in their schools first, in order to make sure that when they get those people, that those people are going to be protected, because you don't want to be causing more harm to people because you've not done the work in order to ensure that they are psychologically safe in the workplace that you are encouraging them to access and be part of. So you know, I think there's a lot of work for us to kind of be thinking about in relation to this. But you know, there's also an issue around progression. You know, I see lots of young teachers going into the profession of different ethnic groups, and they don't progress in their schools, and that's why they end up leaving, because they don't see it as a career move for them. And so we need to kind of address some of those decision making that happens at a senior level that kind of, you know, creates a bar where people are blocked from being in any senior position. So I think there's a lot there that needs to be really delved into to think about how we do this effectively.
Well, thank you, Amna, there for sharing that. That is obviously a very, very personal perspective and story, and I think that's very generous of you to share that information with us and to lead us to that really, really important thinking point, because like you say, you know, we've discussed in various different school meetings that point about psychological safety is so vital for anybody in any environment to thrive. That is the first thing that they need, whether that's a teacher or, you know, coming back to our discussion, a child in the classroom having these discussions about gender and equality. I wonder at this point if anybody wants to type a question in the chat or put their hand up, maybe to open the discussion out to the audience. I'll just leave a moment for that and see if anybody wants to chip in. Go on. So while we're seeing if anybody, I'd be very interested to know kind of a question from my professional setting. So obviously I'm working in a boys' school, and this year we did a piece of research where we asked the boys to give their opinions on women's issues and the role of women in the curriculum. A small minority, we found, really have a long way to travel in terms of the attitudes that they presented. But perhaps more importantly, quite a large proportion of the pupils felt we've kind of heard it all before, we don't want to hear it again. And clearly that attitude that was presented was quite interesting for our school staff to think about how we move forward to reframe the narrative so that boys don't feel blamed. Because when we then did the research into their kind of responses to this survey, there was a huge level of we feel blamed, we feel attacked when we talk about women. So I'd be interested to ask our panelists, potentially Manny, your work in school with young men, what kinds of things can we be doing to ensure that we have this important conversation with young men, but that they don't feel attacked or blamed for something which, you know, at the age of 12, they have not done anything wrong?
I mean, that's a very good question. You know, post the you know, Sarah Everard and, you know, the tragic events relating to Sarah, there were a number of our older, you know, young women who wanted, who felt that there should be a sort of whole school assembly around the issue, which we did. And I said, look, you know, we can do this together. You know, we can prepare this, and you know, I think it was quite you know, there were lots of response for students who sort of said, look, you know, really pleased that we had this discussion and we talked about it, and lots of parents as well. I mean, there was a handful of parents who had a bit of a strange response, you know, and sort of said, look, my son has been accused of being, you know, a sort of woman hater. And we said, look, we recorded the assembly. This is what was said, just so you know. You know, come back to me if you feel that this was, you know, this was the case. I mean, I think in terms of boys in particular, I think I have to be a role model, and I think there is something around leaders being prepared to be vulnerable and show their vulnerability in terms of where they're prepared to go in terms of their own conversations, and their own emotions and how they fit. I think if you want to have the emotional connection and build a level of trust where people are going to open up, that you have to be prepared to open up, and that can be really quite difficult, at times. But I think that is, sometimes I don't think we talk enough on an emotional level with young people, and I think that's quite. I think that's quite important. This example isn't an example that's relating, to women in the curriculum, but here is an example of where sort of I felt me opening up about my own kind of anxieties and worries helped to kind of generate a conversation. So I guess as a head teacher, most of the youngsters in the school will just view you as the head teacher. They'll almost kind of view you as a kind of minor celebrity, in that sense. They don't necessarily always kind of recognize that you kind of have pains, anxieties, you're dealing with, things that regular people are dealing with. So when you're talking about how you feel down with regards to what happened on Sunday, and it's not just about the results, it's because you are emotionally affected yourself, that then kind of sparks a bit more of an open conversation when you're sort of thinking, okay, if you looked at the scenes early on in Wembley, how do you think different people might have felt or feel about going to watch the game? I think when you open up in that way, that can have an effect. So I think in terms of boys, I am a role model as a man, with a family, with daughters, trying to kind of work it out myself. And I think if you create a culture where you are trying to improve yourself and trying to think about how you relate to other people and how you speak to people, then you can set the tone. I've worked in a number of schools where the climate is different, where there might be a kind of aggressive climate or fearful climate, everybody shouting all the time, or you can create a climate where you're trying to be nurturing. Different people will have their own views on that, but I think showing vulnerability is very, very important. I think for male leaders, I think that we have to be able to show young men that you don't have to be this particular person to be respected. You can show emotion. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's a really, really insightful answer. So thank you for that. I think your students are lucky that they've got a leader of the school who is taking that attitude, because it's so brave, isn't it, for any of us in any situation to show vulnerability is hard, and like you say, it does open that conversation up. So thank you for sharing that answer.
Can I just add to what Manny was just saying, and I totally agree with you. It's when you open up and you're genuine and authentic and real, because adults make mistakes, and adults also go through lots of issues in their lives, and probably will always have lots more issues than any young person or child is going to have, because you've just existed in the world longer. And I think one of the things that I always talk about is about when you're delivering any of this work, you have to really be careful about making sure that what you're delivering doesn't shame anyone, doesn't make anyone feel like they are culprits or guilty of anything before anything has ever happened. It is about opening up really safe spaces where young people and children can talk, and all you're offering is really I guess, the activities are meant to open conversation. They're not meant to make anyone feel bad about any particular opinion they might have. There might be opinions that are challenging and that are difficult, and that's where you start then using a questioning and kind of understanding where they might be coming from and where those opinions are coming from. But you also allow young people to challenge each other. You know, as a professional, you don't have to do that challenging all the time. You know, you're opening that space and allowing young people to challenge one another and to talk to one another and see that actually their existence and their attitudes come from somewhere, and these other children and young people also have different attitudes that come from somewhere else. So there's lots of ways to do this, and I think that's why it's so important that whatever you put in the curriculum is really key. That Sandra talked about and Kate talked about earlier, and I saw there a question from Rachel here in terms about curriculum development and whether there's any good systems from abroad. And you know, and I'm not suggesting that this is a better system than what we have, because I don't understand what their actual education system is. But many years ago, I delivered the work around the toolkit in Estonia. And the Estonian government, because they recognized that there was a particular issue around gender-based violence in the country, and they wanted a really strong prevention program, actually put that as their national program across all schools in Estonia. And I think that's the kind of thing that you need. There's nothing wrong necessarily with the way that our education system is. What the problem is what the content is now and whether it's relevant to young people today. And that's what needs to start to shift. And you need to start putting an investment. You know, the government needs to invest in the things that it's saying it wants to do. You can't talk about these really sensitive issues without putting any money in to ensure that teachers are paid better, that they get the right training and the time off. One of the biggest issues that we've had with the training that we've been able to deliver is that they don't have much time. So we've had to shorten a lot of the training sessions that would be like a whole day. We do them in 2 hours now. You know, it's like teachers just don't have the time. They really don't. They're like, you know, particularly over this year, but even, you know, beyond, even before COVID, teachers just do not have the time for that professional development, for their own education, for their own learning. So where do you put that? And some of these conversations maybe are beyond teachers. You know, teachers can't be experts in everything, right? So where do you then have your specialist services coming from outside, being in the school, embedding counselors in school, embedding some of those, you know, specialist providers in your schools is really important. But then who funds those? Well, you know, the voluntary sector has unfortunately been massively hit due to this government. So we need to, you know, there's a lot that needs to be dealt with. And I don't think it's okay for us to say that the responsibility falls all on the shoulders of schools and teachers, because there's no way. I mean, you know, I work in a specialist women's sector services talking about gender-based violence. That's my specialism. That's all I have to generally talk about. I mean, until this weekend, where we're just talking about football and racism in the broader sense. But, you know, generally, you know, we specialize in something, and teachers can't specialize in everything that they're going to have to, you know, come across, you know, that children or young people are dealing with. And things are moving so quickly for young people. You know, everything is developing so quickly. Their information that they're receiving is enormous. They get so much information all the time. So it needs a real curriculum that's reflective, that's progressive, that moves with the times, that doesn't just get stuck in the same people. I mean, my children studied the same books I studied when I was in school. I mean, come on, like, you know, we need to move on. You know, maybe it wasn't even okay for my generation. Never mind, you know, now seeing my kids now, you know, studying the same things that I did. So, you know, we really need something that moves a bit faster. It can't just stay static in the way that it has done. And I think that's where the issue is. It's not so much that, you know, we need to massively change how the system exists, but it's just that the curriculum needs to change and move with the times.
Absolutely, Amna, and that's absolutely building, isn't it, on what Sandra and Kate have said throughout the evening. So thank you for that. And yeah, we have got a question from Rachel in the chat. So I think that'll be our final question of the evening. So you've already touched upon that, Amna. Do any other members of the panel think that there are lessons that we can learn in terms of curriculum development from abroad? So other education systems. I don't know if that's anything that you've ever looked into, Kate, perhaps, or you, Sandra, with your background in policy.
Well, I think that in curriculum development, and it happens at national level, it happens at school level, it happens at classroom level. But I mean, first of all, I'm a great believer in experts. I think curriculum should be developed by the people who are expert in the field, who know what they're doing, who have the background. We've already talked about the diverse voices. I think it needs to be developed by diverse voices, and it also needs to be properly researched. And looking at what happens in other countries and in other places would be essential to that kind of research. I think going back to where we were earlier, I think it's really important that curriculum development doesn't happen on the hoof. It doesn't happen as a knee-jerk reaction. A decision needs to be made. The curriculum needs to develop in this particular way, and you need experts, diverse voices, research, and that would include international research. At the same time, I think, at the very beginning, I said that any curriculum needs to be flexible enough to adapt to the sort of events we've had over the last few weeks. And Manu described earlier how using the PSHE lessons to look at that point in time, because it was relevant today. You can't wait and say, oh, we'll wait till the experts look at that. So it's got to have the two strands. The experts working on a holistic curriculum, but teachers individually being able to say, today this is important and we're going to talk about it in our school because, this moment will pass and we mustn't lose it.
I just add one other thing, Katharine, which is that the government is consulting now on initial teacher training, what it calls its market review of teacher training. It's a slightly strange concept in a public service that it operates as a market, but there we go. And my real fear with this review is that it will actually make our school system and what is taught and how it is taught more homogenous, more monocultural, more prescribed from the centre. And that's completely inimical to what Sandra was saying just now, and Amna and Manny have been saying too all the way through the evening. We have a very determined and traditionalist view from our present government of what good education looks like. I actually think it's founded on a past that didn't exist. When I'm told that children used to learn this, and I think, well, we weren't taught it in my primary school in the 1960s. So when were they learning it? Was it the Victorian era? This is a golden past that never was. But I think everything we are seeing coming out of the direction of travel from Number 10, from the DFE, from the legacy of Michael Gove when he was Education Secretary, is for less diversity, not more diversity. This initial teacher training consultation is just my latest example of it. And I think we're going to have to be very, very vocal, as I think, Manny, Amna, Sandra have been so evocatively tonight about why diversity really, really matters in the curriculum and in the education system. It is an asset, it's a positive. It's so important to young people's chance to develop their potential and their sense of confidence and self. It's so important for our country. We're going to be poorer and less influential if we're less diverse. And I think we need voices like we've heard tonight really making the case for diversity at every stage of the education system, in the curriculum, in the workforce, in who is teaching, what they're teaching, how they're teaching. We need to celebrate this as a real asset, and I'm very concerned that that is not the direction of travel that we're seeing at the moment from the government.
No, Kate, thank you for that. And I think just for helping us to end on that important note of how diversity is an asset, it is important. And, as a young person working in education, that's something I hope that we as a profession can start to change and can start to improve.
Can I just jump in for
yeah, of course.
Because this issue of kind of diversity and representation, I think, is really quite important. And I've just realised that I saw you in a newspaper article earlier on in the week, and it was, am I right? You went to a game. You went to go see England play.
Yeah, we were just watching it in a
Yeah,
hotel bar. It wasn't. Yeah, we weren't in the game.
But that, you know, I remember just seeing that story, because one of the things that's kind of been you know, playing, I think, on lots of people of colour's mind is, you know, what happens if we go out on penalties, or what happens when, you know, that will be something that is on all people of colour, you know, colour's mind. And actually, when I saw the image, I thought, well, since you're on the call, I'm going to tell you that actually inspired me. You know, it kind of just reminded, me that the team is for everybody, you know, and it was an image that, you know, you may not have realised, you know, but the people from all over the country would have looked at it and sort of thought, you know what, I feel just that little bit braver to challenge things. So I thought, you know, I'd just share that, because if you don't see people doing that, then, you know, you could sometimes feel, you know, a bit hemmed in, or your world kind of feels a bit more closed. And I want my daughters to kind of have a bit more of a kind of feel a bit freer to travel the world and to travel the country than perhaps I feel, you know. So I wanted to say that visibility is really important, and it does make a difference in unexpected places.
Yeah, very unexpected places, but thank you. That is really beautiful to hear. Yeah, it means a lot to hear those kinds of reflections from people, because yeah, it's been an insane couple of weeks, because, you know, when that went viral, that picture that ended up in the Guardian or whatever it was, it's essentially what led to that petition. So yeah, it's I'm glad that it's having an impact on people, and I really appreciate you sharing that with me.
Yeah, and nice there to end on kind of, I think we've managed to widen this discussion out massively. You know, we started with gender equality in the curriculum, and look where we've ended up. We've been talking about equality more widely and diversity in football. So just a massive thank you to all of our panelists for this evening. You know, you've been incredibly generous to give us your time and your expertise. It's been a really enjoyable discussion, and I've certainly learned a huge amount. So thank you very much for volunteering that. And thank you as well to the people who've joined us. I hope that you've got as much out of it as I have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Katharine, for hosting. You were brilliant.
Thank you. Right, well, take care, everyone, and have a nice evening.
Just a quick question.
Andrew, thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Bye-bye.
Just keep the call going for a second.
Of course, yeah. I won't end it.
Amna, did you go to Oxford Community School by any chance? Were you familiar with Oxford Community School? You're not Oxford based at all?
No.
No. Okay.
I used to live in North London, and then I've lived 20 odd years in Manchester now. So
okay.
Yeah.
But in all seriousness, you know, you know, the picture was so influential, because it just bigged at a time where things needed to be bigged up. It bigged it up.
Well, I'm glad. It's interesting. I think things at the right time make an impact, and it's still making an impact. So hopefully you'll be seeing lots more coming out this week in terms of responses from the FA and government and everyone else. The Labour Party has also responded, so hopefully there'll be some good shifts and changes happening in relation to the petition. But yeah, no one would have listened though if we didn't get to the million, and if we didn't get to everyone's support and passing it around. And it's just incredible to have seen everyone's kind of responses to it. So yeah, thank you for that.
Well done. Katharine, thanks for bringing us all together. I really enjoyed it and learned loads. Made lots of notes, so thank you.
Yeah, so did I.
No, you were brilliant.
Thank you for sharing
Thank you. Great job, Katharine. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. No, well, have a lovely evening, and hopefully we can all meet again soon for another lively discussion.
Take care. Thanks very much.
Take care.
Thanks. Take care,
Andrew,
everybody.
thank you, Katharine.
Thanks. Bye-bye.